December 28th, 1992, 3 p.m. Saltburn by the Sea, England. Two people arrive at a public restroom near the Victorian Pier. Doris and her 23-year-old son, Stephen. They're finishing a 2-mile walk along the cold Yorkshire coastline. They've just walked from Marske to Saltburn together. Stephen has a pronounced limp from a childhood accident. His left arm hangs useless at his side, badly damaged. They both need to use the facilities. The mother heads into the ladies' room. Her son enters through the door marked Gents, and he never comes out. This is the mystery of what happened inside those four walls. This is the case that would tear a family apart, which led to the arrests of Stephen's own mother, Doris, and father, Charles, decades later, and left investigators completely baffled. This is the disappearance of Stephen Clark, the man who walked into a public restroom with his mother on a winter afternoon and never walked out. Before we dive into Stephen's story, please consider subscribing to this channel. We create true mystery and crime cases every week, so if that's what you're looking for, hit subscribe.
You are watching True Crime Lens.
Stephen Clark was born on August 30th, 1969 in Colchester, Essex. He came into a world filled with love. His parents, Charles and Doris Clark, were both police officers who had met while serving in Cleveland. 14 months after Stephen was born, his little sister Victoria joined the family. By all accounts, it was a happy childhood. Victoria would later say they couldn't have wished for better parents or a more love-filled home. But when Stephen was just 2 years old, his life changed upside down. Doris was out running errands in Scotland, where the family was living at the time. Stephen, curious and adventurous like any toddler, wandered out onto the road and was hit by a truck. The accident was devastating. Stephen fell into a coma for a month, and when he finally woke up, his life would never be the same. His left arm was severely damaged, and he could no longer use it. His leg was injured too, leaving him with a pronounced limp that made walking difficult and painful. Doctors weren't even sure if he would be able to speak again. But Stephen was a fighter. He recovered far beyond what anyone expected. He learned to walk again, despite his injuries. He learned to talk. He learned to live with his disabilities. And he did it with a smile on his face. Those who knew Stephen described him as happy, always smiling, always taking life in his stride. His sister Victoria remembered his great sense of humor. She said he had an infectious laugh that made everyone around him laugh too. In the early 1980s, the Clark family made a big decision. They moved to South Africa, hoping for better opportunities. They lived there for about 10 years, and during that time, Stephen grew into a young man. He loved music and played the baritone euphonium. Even with his physical disability, he was a great swimmer. But by 1990, the family decided it was time to return to England. They first settled in Guildford, Surrey, before moving to Marske by the Sea near Redcar in North Yorkshire. The move was partly to support Stephen, because despite his determination and skills, he was struggling to find work. You see, in the early 1990s, people with disabilities faced enormous discrimination when it came to employment. Employers would see Stephen's limp, his damaged arm, and they would turn him away, even though he was capable and hardworking. So, Stephen attended the Rathbone Society in Redcar, an organization that helped people with disabilities improve their employment skills, and he excelled. He worked so hard that he even won an Apprentice of the Year award. Stephen had friends. He visited the local pub regularly. He had recently been on a date. He was living his life the best way he could, adapting to his limitations, but never letting them define him. December 28th started like any other day during the Christmas break. Stephen's father, Charles, had a ticket to watch soccer that afternoon. Stephen, being a huge soccer fan himself, wanted to go with his dad, but Charles told him he could only come if he paid for his own ticket. Now, according to the family, this was a bit of a running joke inside the family. Stephen was known for being careful with his money. He didn't like spending it. So when his dad said he had to pay for his own ticket, Stephen got a bit put out about it and decided not to go. Looking back now, that decision kept Stephen home that afternoon. If he had gone to the match with his father, maybe things would have turned out differently. With Charles off at the soccer match, Stephen decided to go for a walk with his mother, Doris. They would walk from their home in Marske to the neighboring town of Saltburn by the sea, a distance of about 2 miles along the coast. When you think about that for a moment, 2 miles is quite a long walk for anyone. But for someone with Stephen's mobility challenges, with his damaged leg and pronounced limp, it would have been exhausting. But Stephen loved the beach, loved being outdoors, so off they went, mother and son, walking together along the windswept Yorkshire coast. It was a cold winter afternoon, the kind of day where the wind bites at your face and the sky is gray and heavy. But they walked together, chatting, enjoying each other's company. Neither of them knew that in just a few hours, their lives would be torn apart forever. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Stephen and Doris reached Saltburn. They had walked the entire length of the beach from Marske, and now they both needed to use the restroom. Near Saltburn Pier, right on the promenade overlooking the sea, stood a public toilet block. Nothing fancy, just a typical British seaside public convenience. Men's room on one side, women's on the other. Doris went into the women's restroom. Stephen went into the men's, and that was the last time his mother saw him. When Doris came out of the restroom, Stephen wasn't waiting outside. She looked around and waited for a few minutes. No sign of him. But instead of checking the men's room, instead of calling out for him, Doris made an assumption. She assumed Stephen had finished before her and had started walking home on his own, so she began the 2-mile walk back to Marske, alone. She calculated that since Stephen is slow on walking, she could catch up on the way. When Doris arrived home, Stephen wasn't there. Time passed. Still, no Stephen. Concern began to creep in. Where was he? He should have been home by now, even with his slow pace. As the afternoon turned to evening and darkness fell over the Yorkshire coast, the Clark family realized something was terribly wrong. Stephen was missing. They contacted the police and reported him missing. But back in 1992, police typically waited 24 hours before actively investigating a missing adult. After all, adults have the right to go where they please. And many missing person reports turn out to be misunderstanding. But Stephen never came home that night, or the next day, or the day after that. He had simply vanished. Here's something that makes this case even stranger. When Stephen left the house that afternoon for his walk with his mother, he left behind 3 very important items: his wallet, his eyeglasses, his watch. If you were planning to leave somewhere and start a new life, would you leave without your money? Without your glasses if you needed them to see clearly? Probably not. Stephen left the house wearing a maroon crewneck jumper, a navy blue parka with a fur-lined hood, blue denim jeans, and gray trainers. Just everyday clothes for a winter walk. Nothing special, nothing that would help him survive on his own for long. And remember, he had won that Apprentice of the Year award. There was a cash prize associated with it, a reward he had earned through his hard work. But Stephen never collected that money. Would you walk away from money you had rightfully earned? Money that could help you start fresh somewhere new? The evidence all pointed to one conclusion. Stephen hadn't planned to disappear. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't voluntary. But then, where was he? Police began searching the area around Saltburn Pier and the public toilets. They combed the beaches, checked the cliffs, and questioned local residents. Had anyone seen a tall young man with a pronounced limp walking alone that afternoon? The Victorian pier stretched out into the North Sea, and the dramatic cliffs of the Yorkshire coast loomed above the beaches. This was dangerous terrain, especially for someone with mobility challenges. Could Stephen have fallen? Could he have wandered too close to the cliff edge and tumbled down onto the rocks below? Search teams looked for any sign of him, but they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Stephen had ever been there at all. And here's where things get even more mysterious. In the days after Stephen vanished, 2 people came forward saying they might have seen him. On December 30th, 2 days after the disappearance, a man named Stan Cornish reported seeing Stephen in the town of Redcar at around 2 in the afternoon. He said he saw a man with a similar limp walking down the road toward town. But when police questioned him more closely, Stan backtracked. He said he had seen the man from about 30 yards away and couldn't clearly see his face, so he couldn't be sure it was Stephen. That sighting fell apart. Then, on January 14th, 1993, an unnamed woman reported seeing Stephen at around 5 in the evening. She claimed she saw him through her window, walking with an older man, someone who appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, with gray hair and glasses. She said Stephen seemed to be trying to keep up with this man as they walked toward Glenside Terrace in Saltburn. But police noted problems with this sighting too. The distance from her window to where she claimed to have seen him was considerable. And at 5 o'clock in mid-January in England, it would have been completely dark. How could she have made a positive identification in those conditions? That sighting couldn't be verified either. So essentially, after Stephen walked into that men's restroom at 3 o'clock on December 28th, 1992, no one could say with certainty that they had ever seen him again. How does someone just disappear like that, in broad daylight, from a public place? The years passed. Stephen's family never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering. But as time went on with no answers, the case grew cold. Police moved on to other investigations. The media stopped reporting on it. Stephen Clark became just another name in the files of missing persons. But in 1999, 7 years after Stephen vanished, something happened that would reignite the investigation decades later. Cleveland police received a letter, an anonymous handwritten letter sent to Gisborough Police Station. The letter was described as very precise in nature, and it made a shocking claim. It said Stephen was dead. Not only that, but the writer claimed to know who was responsible for his death. After 7 years of not knowing, suddenly someone out there claimed to have answers. But who were they? Why were they writing anonymously? And most importantly, were they telling the truth? Police never revealed the full contents of the letter to the public. They kept it secret, hoping perhaps that the real killer would make a mistake, say something that only the letter writer would know. But without knowing who wrote it, without being able to verify the claims, the letter just sat in the case files, a tantalizing clue that led nowhere. For more than 20 years, the identity of the letter writer remained a mystery, and Stephen Clark remained missing. By 2020, Stephen had been missing for 28 years. Charles and Doris Clark were now in their late 70s and early 80s. Their daughter Victoria had spent her entire adult life not knowing what happened to her brother. But in 2020, the Cleveland and North Yorkshire Cold Case Review team decided to take another look at Stephen's disappearance. With modern forensic techniques and fresh eyes on old evidence, they reopened the investigation. They made public appeals for information. They released old video footage from Stephen's training at the Rathbone Society, footage that showed him working confidently at a computer, showing his distinctive walk and his voice. They hoped someone, somewhere, would recognize him or remember something.
Using the yellow pages and the business directory.
And then, in September 2020, something remarkable happened. A woman came forward with information she had kept to herself for 28 years. She said that on December 28, 1992, she had been out with her family in the late afternoon. They were walking on the high street in Marske toward Marske Square when they saw Stephen. She said he passed them, walking in the opposite direction, heading toward the Ship Inn, a local pub. This was huge because remember, it got dark that day around 3:45 p.m. If this woman saw Stephen in Marske in the late afternoon before darkness fell, then he had successfully left the public toilets in Saltburn and made it back toward his home area. The public toilets weren't his last known location after all. The woman said she had seen the original 1992 appeal and even confirmed with her family at the time that it was the missing 23-year-old they had seen. But she didn't think it was relevant to the case, so she never came forward. Until now, this testimony changed everything. If Stephen made it back to Marske, then what happened to him there? Did he make it home and then leave again? Did he encounter someone he knew? Did something happen between the high street and his house? But the investigation was about to take an even more shocking turn. Remember that mysterious letter from 1999? The one claiming to know who killed Stephen? In December 2020, police released images of the envelope and excerpts from the letter to the public. They hoped someone would recognize the handwriting or that the writer themselves might come forward after all these years. And incredibly, they did. For the first time in 21 years, police were able to speak to the person who wrote that letter. Detective Chief Inspector Sean Page called it a significant moment in the investigation. But what did the letter writer tell them? Did they have real information, or had they just been speculating all those years ago? Police never revealed what was discussed in that conversation. The contents remained secret. The investigation was heating up. A new witness placing Stephen in Marske, the anonymous letter writer, finally identified. Police were following multiple lines of inquiry, and then came the bombshell that would shock everyone. On September 24th, 2020, police arrested 2 people on suspicion of murdering Stephen Clark. Those 2 people were Charles and Doris Clark, Stephen's own parents. The elderly couple, now aged 78 and 81, were taken from their home in Marske and held in police custody. Can you imagine? After 28 years of living with the pain of not knowing what happened to their son, they were being accused of killing him. Charles said he was in the shower when police arrived. Doris was told she could finish her breakfast but had an hour to gather her things before having to leave. Police conducted an intensive 5-day forensic examination of the Clark home. They dug up the garden, searching for Stephen's remains. They searched the attic. They moved the shed. They turned elderly couples' lives upside down. Charles described it as surreal. He said, after 28 years of Stephen being missing, why suddenly pounce on us like that and within 24 hours take us out of our home and lock us away? I thought it was a joke. I was looking for the cameras. Doris found the experience scary and ludicrous, being held in police cells at her age, accused of murdering her own son. But why? What evidence did the police have that led them to arrest Stephen's parents? Well, some people had always found Doris's behavior that day suspicious. Why would she leave the toilets without checking on Stephen? Why would she assume he had walked home alone when he had significant mobility challenges? It seemed strange. Both Charles and Doris were former police officers. They would have understood investigative procedures. They would have known how to construct a story, how to avoid leaving evidence. Did that make them suspects? And then there was that anonymous letter from 1999 claiming to know who killed Stephen. Had the letter pointed toward his parents all along? Some people speculated that maybe caring for a disabled adult son had become too much. Maybe there had been an accident, something that went wrong, and they panicked. Maybe Stephen had never made it to those toilets at all. Maybe he had died earlier and the whole story was fabricated. For 17 weeks, Charles and Doris Clark remained under investigation. They were released on bail, but had to live with the knowledge that police suspected them of the worst crime imaginable, killing their own child. In February 2021, after 5 months of intensive investigation, police made an announcement. Charles and Doris Clark were being released without charge. Detective Chief Inspector Sean Page stated that officers had followed a significant number of lines of inquiry since launching the murder investigation, but they had found no proof that the Clarks had harmed their son. No evidence in the garden, no forensic evidence in the house, nothing that could build a case against them. But the experience had taken its toll on the elderly couple. They had been publicly arrested, their homes searched, their reputations questioned. Even though they were released without charge, some people would always wonder. Some people would always suspect. The ordeal devastated them. But police weren't giving up on the case. In April 2021, they conducted additional searches at Saltburn Bank, a steep hillside with thick undergrowth that runs from the bottom of the Valley Gardens to the top of a walkway near the Spa Hotel. It was about 2.5 miles from Marske. Using modern forensic techniques, search teams combed the area. They were looking for any trace of Stephen, any evidence that might explain what happened to him all those years ago. But once again, they found nothing. Detective Chief Inspector Page stated clearly that police believed Stephen had come to serious harm at the hands of a third party. Not his parents. Someone else. But who? So what do we know for certain? Let's piece together the facts. Stephen Clark was a 23-year-old man with significant physical disabilities. On December 28, 1992, he went for a walk with his mother from Marske to Saltburn, a 2-mile walk along the coast. At around 3 p.m., they both used the public toilets near Saltburn Pier. Stephen went into the men's room. His mother went into the women's room. When Doris came out, Stephen wasn't there. She walked home alone, assuming he had left before her. A witness has since come forward saying she saw Stephen in Marske in the late afternoon heading toward the ship inn, so he did leave those toilets. He did make it back toward his home area. But after that, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no evidence, no trace. Stephen left behind his wallet, his glasses, and his watch. He never collected the cash prize from his award. He simply vanished into thin air. For 32 years, police have searched for answers. They've followed countless leads. They've arrested and released his parents. They've searched beaches and cliffs and gardens. They've used modern forensic techniques and old-fashioned detective work, and they've found nothing. So what happened to Stephen Clark? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them have a happy ending. Could Stephen have chosen to disappear and start a new life? Some people have suggested this. After all, he was struggling to find employment because of discrimination against people with disabilities. Maybe he wanted to escape to start fresh somewhere no one knew him. But would he really leave without his wallet, without his glasses, without collecting money he had earned? And how would someone with such distinctive physical features, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with a severe limp and a damaged arm, how would someone like that disappear without being recognized for more than 30 years? It seems almost impossible. Could he have had an accident? The Yorkshire coast is dangerous. Dramatic cliffs tower above rocky beaches. The sea is cold and unforgiving. Stephen could have wandered too close to the edge and fallen. He could have entered the water and drowned. But bodies wash ashore. Remains are found. The area has been searched repeatedly for more than 3 decades. With all the modern technology available, with all the people who walk those beaches every single day, wouldn't something have been found by now? Could he have been abducted? Could someone have taken him against his will? The public toilet was a relatively isolated location. Stephen was vulnerable. Someone could have targeted him. But abducting a 6'3" man from a public place in the middle of the afternoon is risky and difficult, and Stephen's physical disabilities would have made him harder to move quickly. Plus, why? What would be the motive? Or did Stephen encounter someone after leaving the toilets? Someone he knew, or someone he met by chance? Did something go wrong, an argument that escalated, a confrontation that turned violent? Did someone harm him, either intentionally or accidentally, and then hide his body so well that it has never been found? Police believe this is the most likely scenario. They classify Stephen's disappearance as suspected murder. They believe he came to serious harm at the hands of a third party. But there is one last and hardest theory to discuss. What would make police suspect a mother and father of killing their disabled child? Let's start with Doris's behavior that day. She came out of the women's restroom and Stephen wasn't waiting outside. And what did she do? She just walked home, alone, without checking the men's room, without calling out for him, without waiting to see if he would emerge in a few moments. Think about that. Your 23-year-old son has significant disabilities, a damaged arm he can't use, a severe limp that makes walking difficult and painful. You've just walked 2 miles together along a cold beach. You both stop to use the public toilets. And when you come out and he's not there, you just assume he's walked home ahead of you? Does that make sense? Would you do that? Many people have found this strange, even suspicious. Stephen needed at least 15 to 20 minutes just to walk from the toilets back to the main road because of his mobility issues. Doris would have easily caught up with him if he had really left first. But she claims she never saw him on the walk home. Here's something even more troubling. No one has ever come forward to verify that they saw Stephen and Doris walking together that day. Not on the beach from Marske to Saltburn. Not at the public toilets. Nobody. The witness who came forward in 2020 said she saw Stephen in Marske in the late afternoon, but she didn't mention seeing him with his mother. She saw him alone. So some people began to wonder, Did that walk even happen? Or was Stephen already dead before Doris claimed they left the house? Then there's the anonymous letter from 1999. Someone wrote to police saying they knew who killed Stephen. The letter was described as very precise, very specific, and shortly after police finally spoke to that letter writer in 20, they arrested Charles and Doris. The timing seems significant, doesn't it? And here's a question that haunts this case. If you were a former police officer and you wanted to cover up your son's death, why would you create such an elaborate, risky story? Why say he vanished from a public toilet in the middle of the day when there could be witnesses? Why not just say he went to the shops and never came home? That would be simpler, less suspicious, harder to disprove. Unless the elaborate story was necessary because Stephen died at home and you needed to move his body somewhere else. You needed to steer the police away from the house premises. The walk to Saltburn, the public toilets, maybe it was all a cover story to explain why Stephen left the house that day. Some people have speculated about motive. Caring for an adult disabled child is challenging. It's exhausting physically and emotionally. Stephen was struggling to find work because of discrimination. He was dependent on his parents. Maybe the stress became too much. Maybe there was an argument that got out of hand. Maybe something happened accidentally and they panicked. There's also the football ticket incident that morning. Charles told Stephen he had to pay for his own ticket if he wanted to attend the match. Stephen got upset about it. Was there tension in the house that day? Had something been building? Police clearly thought they had enough to make an arrest. They held Charles and Doris in custody. They dug up their garden, searching for Stephen's remains. They searched the house for 5 days looking for evidence. They kept the elderly couple under investigation for 17 weeks. You don't do that without reason. You don't arrest grieving parents nearly 30 years after their son disappeared, unless you have substantial cause for suspicion. But here's the problem with this theory. After all that investigation, after all that searching, police found nothing. No body in the garden, no forensic evidence in the house, no blood, no DNA, nothing that could link Charles and Doris to their son's death. And in February 2021, they were released without charge. Let's look at the evidence that suggests they're innocent. First, the family by all accounts was loving and close. Victoria, Stephen's sister, described their childhood as happy and love-filled. She said they couldn't have wished for better parents. There's no history of violence, no reports of abuse, no indication that this was anything other than a caring family dealing with the challenges of Stephen's disability. Stephen himself was described as happy, smiling, sociable. He had friends, he went to pubs, he'd recently been on a date, he was working hard at the Rathbone Society and had won an award. Does that sound like someone living in an abusive or dangerous home environment? Second, if Charles and Doris had killed Stephen, why would they create such a risky cover story? They were both former police officers. They would have known that saying he disappeared from a public location in broad daylight would invite scrutiny. They would have known that witnesses might come forward to contradict their story. They would have known that the lack of a body would keep the case open indefinitely. A simpler story, Stephen went out alone and never came back, would have been much safer, much easier to maintain, much harder to investigate. Third, where's the body? Charles and Doris were in their 50s in 1992. Stephen was 23 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and despite his disabilities, he had upper body strength. If they'd killed him, how did they dispose of his body so completely that 30-plus years of searching, including modern forensic techniques, have found nothing? Their home was searched thoroughly. Their garden was excavated. The surrounding areas were combed. Nothing. If they had hidden Stephen's body, where is it? Fourth, the witness who came forward in 2020 reported seeing Stephen alive in Marske in the late afternoon on December 28th. This corroborates at least part of Doris's story that Stephen did leave the toilets and was making his way back toward home. If the parents had killed him earlier and fabricated the whole walk story, how do we explain this witness seeing Stephen alive that afternoon? And finally, consider their behavior over 3 decades. Charles, Doris, and Victoria have continued to publicly appeal for information about Stephen. They've worked with Missing People Charity, they've participated in media interviews, They've kept his case in the public eye. Would guilty parents really do that? Would they invite continued scrutiny, continued investigation, continued media attention? Or would they quietly hope the case faded into obscurity? When Charles and Doris were released in 2021, Doris said it was never going to be any other way, really. She said it with confidence, like someone who knew they were innocent all along. Mark Williams Thomas, a former detective who spent considerable time with the couple, stated clearly, "I asked Charles very direct questions. I'm very confident that they didn't kill Stephen." So what do we believe? This is the agonizing part of this theory. The evidence goes both ways. Doris's behavior that day seems strange, but it's not proof of murder. The lack of witnesses seeing them together is suspicious, but it's not evidence of guilt. The police investigation was thorough, but it found nothing concrete. On one hand, you have a mother's odd decision to walk home alone, two former police officers with the knowledge to cover up a crime, and police who clearly suspected them enough to make arrests. On the other hand, you have a loving family with no history of violence, a risky cover story that doesn't make sense for experienced police officers to create, no body despite extensive searches, and ultimately, no charges filed. The truth is, we don't know. After 17 weeks of investigation, after searching their home and garden, after following every possible lead, police had to release Charles and Doris without charge. That doesn't mean they're innocent, but it also doesn't prove they're guilty. And that's what makes this case so haunting. Even the most obvious suspects, even Stephen's own parents, remain in that terrible gray area between suspicion and proof. What do you think? Could a mother and father really harm their own disabled son? Or are Charles and Doris Clark just two more victims of Stephen's mysterious disappearance? Grieving parents who had to endure the added trauma of being suspected of the worst crime imaginable. On December 28, 1992, Stephen Clark walked into a public restroom in Saltburn by the sea. He never walked out, or if he did, no one knows where he went after that. No one knows what happened in those final hours or minutes of his life. No one knows if he's lying in an unmarked grave somewhere, or lost at sea, or impossibly still alive somehow. The case remains unsolved. The mystery remains impenetrable, and a family remains heartbroken, desperate for answers that may never come. Thank you for listening to Stephen's story today. His case haunts me, as I'm sure it haunts you now too. A young man with his whole life ahead of him, just gone, vanished into thin air on a cold December afternoon. If this case touched you, if you want to help keep Stephen's memory alive, please share this story. Talk about it with your friends and family. Keep his name out there, because attention is what solves cold cases. Public pressure is what generates new leads. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there knows something that could finally bring Stephen home. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the truth is out there somewhere. We just have to keep looking for it.